With a 19mm socket, remove all these plastic nuts that hold on your hubcap, if you have this. Remove the hubcap, and then with a 19mm socket, remove all 5 of your lug nuts, and then take the wheel off. Next, I want to break free the banjo bolt on the old caliper. So with an 11mm, just break this free. Fluid's going to come out, so I have a collection bucket ready to catch it. I'm going to snug it up just a little bit, just so fluid doesn't drip out, but at least it's broken free, so once the caliper is disconnected, I'll have an easier time removing this bolt. Next, I want to take off the whole caliper assembly, so caliper with bracket directly off the knuckle. I'm not going to bother separating it here, because I can get the pads out without doing that. So, unbolt this, 15mm socket, take the caliper off, and I like to put it right on top of the knuckle here. That way it doesn't pull on the brake hose and it will stay here safely. Next, I want to prepare the new caliper for installation. That requires it to be disassembled. So with my 14mm socket, I'm going to remove these 2 bolts and separate the caliper from the bracket. It's easiest if you have an impact of some sort. Otherwise, you'll have to hold the caliper and do it by hand, and it's just going to want to spin. Separate the 2, set this aside, and let's focus on the bracket itself. We're going to have to grease up these 2 areas where the anti-rattle clips ride, just so that rust doesn't build up in the future. It might still build up, but at least with grease in here, it'll help prolong the life of the surface here. So do this to both sides, of course, and don't put too much, because if you put too much, well, it'll squeeze out onto the rotor, and obviously that is not good. So just a light coating. This should be good. Now we can take the clips and just press them on. There we go. And if for some reason you did put too much grease and it squeezes out when you press these on, now is the time to wipe it off before the rotor gets in here and gets contaminated with grease. Next, I also want to add grease to the 2 slider pins, and I'm going to do them one at a time because one of them has this rubber bushing, the other one does not, and I want to put them back exactly where they came from because this has a purpose and there's a reason why it was put in this hole and not this one. So, put some grease on the sliders. Make sure you get some grease up on that top ridge there. That's where the boot seals up. And if you don't get grease in there, water can make its way in eventually and wash out the grease and rust out the pin. I'm also going to put some grease into the bore here, into the boot, I should say. And this is going to act as a reserve of grease for the caliper. And because I can't put a lot on the slider pin, since it'll get washed off or wiped off as I slide it in, that's why I put it into the boot. Okay, push the slider in all the way. As you can see, there's excess air, and if you just squeeze the boot, the air will come out. Wipe off any excess grease that might be here, and do the same thing to this side. And if for some reason you put too much, it'll just squeeze out. It's hard to overpack these, because when you do this, if there's too much grease, well, it'll just come right out. In my case, everything looks fine. The boot compresses. You'll know if there's too much because the boot won't compress all the way. So right now I'm squeezing out some air. Perfect. Let's get this on the vehicle. At this point, I have a new rotor, so I don't have to worry about it, but you want to pull the rotor off and clean inside there where the rotor mounts on the hub if yours is in bad condition. If not, then don't worry about it. Next, put the new bracket on. Start on the 2 mounting bolts, snug them up, and torque them to 96 foot-pounds. Now, just as a side note, if you were to put anything on the threads of these, use thread locker, not anti-seize or grease. Next, it's time to put the pads in, but our pads are still stuck in the old caliper, so just flip it around and you can simply push them out just like this, slide them out through the middle. Do the same for this one, and take the pads and slide them in to the new bracket. Make sure that the one with the wear indicator goes on the inboard side with the wear indicator on the bottom. Okay, everything's good. Now take your brand new caliper, apply a little bit of grease to these 2 ears, like this, a thin layer. This will help the pads operate quietly and smoothly. And I'm also going to add some to this outer ring of the piston for the same exact reason. And I like to apply it to the caliper, not the pad, because if you put it on the pad, you don't really know where to apply it in order to not get it all over the place and Well, doing it this way is just a little less messy. Take the caliper, slide it over, make sure that the slider pin's lined up, start in the 2 bolts, snug them up and torque them to 26 foot-pounds. If you're going to use anything on the threads, use thread locker, not anti-seize or grease. Next, I'm going to remove the new banjo bolt with the 2 copper washers. Make sure they don't fall off, and definitely don't reuse the old ones. You don't want to do that. Leave one of the washers on the bolt because you'll need it on one side of the hose, and then the hose goes on and then the other washer basically sandwiches the hose together. Now, off of the old caliper, go ahead and pull the banjo bolt off and remove the hose. Again, fluid will come out at this point, so make sure you have something to catch that fluid. The caliper is going to drain. Let that do its thing. Set it aside. Remove the old banjo bolt and throw it out. You have a new one. Make sure the surface is clean and free of any debris. Slide the new banjo bolt through with one of the new washers. Then, just like I said before, sandwich the hose in between the 2 washers, so add another one. And then just line it up with the caliper and start in the bolt. Thread it on all the way, and then we'll tighten it and make it nice and snug. The goal here is to basically crush those copper washers, and that's what's going to make a nice seal so that brake fluid doesn't leak out. So that's bottomed out. I'm going to probably go about half a turn from here, maybe a little bit less. Okay, that was almost half a turn in total. So right there I'm going to stop. I'm going to clean up my mess. It's important to do that because you don't want to confuse residual fluid from the hose swapping with a leak. You want to know if there's actually a leak. So make sure everything is nice and clean. And then let's open up the bleeder screw and let gravity pull the fluid down and push the air out. Take off this little cap. So we're going to do a gravity bleed, and that entails letting gravity pull the fluid down and push the air out. Once I have a steady trickle of fluid coming out of here with the gravity bleed, I'm going to perform a full manual brake bleed, which consists of first topping off your master cylinder to make sure that it's full. Then you have someone in the car pumping up the brake pedal. After 3 or 4 pumps, have them hold pressure, and then you can open up this bleeder screw. With it open, air and fluid will come out of here, so watch out. And once the pedal has reached the floor, you can close this up, pump up again, and open it, and so on and so forth until you get no more air bubbles coming out. At the end, you would want to top off your master cylinder, and well, then you can finish with the job, putting the wheel on and everything. But for now, let's wait for gravity to do its thing and pull the fluid through. Okay, this is a very nice, very fast trickle of fluid, which is perfect. I'm going to stop, close this up. I'm going to clean up my mess and temporarily cap it off, but I will do a full manual brake bleed like I said. And always it's important to clean up your oil spillage because, well, you don't want to confuse anything that was there with a leak. And assuming you're done with your manual brake bleed and you're ready to move on, cap it off, and let's put on the wheel. Let's get the wheel back on. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and torque them to 100 foot-pounds. Grab your hubcap, if you have one, and line it up with the valve stem. There's a hole here for it, otherwise the valve stem will get crushed and probably this won't even line up. So go ahead and line that up, and then thread in the little caps. This is what holds on your hubcap. And I prefer doing these by hand because if you over tighten them, which is very easy to do with a power tool, then they just strip out and then your hubcap goes flying off while you're driving, which is not great. So make those nice and snug by hand and take it for a road test.